When you dare to share, you break the silence. When you dare to share, you speak your truth. When you dare to share, you use the full strength of your voice. When you dare to share, it brings opportunity to own your story. So tell it, be heard, and at the same time, your sharing is someone else's learning, inspiration, motivation, empowerment, and hope. There's always an element to each of our stories that remains a secret. For some, we feel it's a dirty little secret. Dare to share your untold story exposes these secrets in a welcoming and positive way. I encourage each of you out there to dare yourself to share what is yours to tell. When we dare, it is the courage to do something really important. Let this be a vow to each and every single one of us that we take risk, we brave, confront, and face what is, while inspiring and empowering all communities. So let's break that silence and tap into mental beauty. This is Salima Jadabji, your podcast host, a practicing clinical social worker, and your mental wellness connoisseur. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast, episode number 37, Living in the Present in Full Vulnerability when 9/11 turned it all upside down. To all my fellow listeners, before we get started, I'm just dropping in a note to give you a heads up that this podcast might be emotionally triggering for you. We do invite guests onto the show who share openly about extremely difficult life moments with exposure and impact of what the struggles have been like. The intensity of each episode could have a variable impact on your emotional and mental well-being based on your own personal story. If at any point the topic becomes uncomfortable or upsetting to you in any way, please do not pressure yourself to listen. Instead, be kind to yourself, do some self-care, and perhaps give another episode a try. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our awesome and daring guest, Marnie Sigmar. Marnie is a mom, partner, daughter, auntie, sister, and friend. She received her Master of Urban Planning and Bachelor of Arts with honors in Political Science and Sociology from Queen's University. Marnie regularly volunteers and serves on the board of directors of nonprofit organizations, and through Sigmar Consulting, Marnie works with nonprofit organizations to raise funds, develop effective communications, and assist with organizational change. She has facilitated strategic planning, conducted capital campaigns, and led executive hiring committees. Marnie previously held roles in management and director levels at Yellow Brick House in York Region, Ontario, a nonprofit organization that provides shelter and supportive services to women and children who have experienced domestic violence, Corporation for Supportive Housing in Chicago, Illinois, a nonprofit organization that advocates for housing for lowest income families, and at Inspiration Cafe, also in Chicago, Illinois, a nonprofit organization that provides restaurant-style meals and programs to people experiencing homelessness. Hello, Marnie. Welcome to the Dare to Share Your Untold Story podcast.
Hi, Salima. Thank you very much.
Oh, Marnie, let me just tell you how great it is to have you on the show today. And let me also tell you how much gratitude I have for you to just be open and willing to share today. And of course, I'm also thankful for your support for taking a stance with me to help break barriers of mental stigma.
It's my complete pleasure. Thanks, Salima.
Wonderful. Okay, so Marnie, in case you're still wondering, this podcast, it's really about bringing forward those untold stories, those deeper stories that people go through in life, whether it's directly about a mental health struggle or something else. And what we know is that no matter what the story is, there's always an element of impact to a person's mental health in some way. And that's the part that usually remains tucked away. It's the part that usually is not expressed. So this platform serves in a way to break those barriers of mental stigma, which have been conditioned in our society. So our presence together, having conversation today, I hope it's really to encourage people to share and tell what people would normally have reservations for expressing. And so on that note, I am bringing forward a trend called the mental beauty rethink. What comes to mind for you, Marnie, when you hear the words mental beauty?
I love the idea of mental beauty. I think what comes to mind to me first is that I grew up always understanding that taking care of your physical health was terribly important. But what I have come to really appreciate is that taking care of mental health is equally, if not more important. And so I love the idea of mental beauty because it celebrates the importance of putting mental health first in a way that is a practice rather than a response.
Right. I like that. It really is a practice, and it's just like hygiene, right? Like it's not a one-time deal. You just have to keep working on it, and it's small doses every day of different things that put things together to address your mental wellness. And I like what you said about practicing versus responding.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the idea of mental beauty really gives me hope that people will, and myself included, will make that not only a part of their personal practice, but that practice will become part of what we talk about as openly as we do other aspects of our wellness, so that sort of the stigma is taken away about mental health being something that is bad and you're responding to something bad, but also that mental health becomes something that you're making a very beautiful part of your life.
Yeah, and accepting all parts of it, right? And it doesn't have to be seen as something so awful or terrible, as you said. It doesn't have to be bad. Just like how physical health, it could be good, bad, and ugly, right? Mental health could be as well, but we also know that physical health can also be wonderful, and so can mental health. And it's up to us to put the work in to make the adjustments. And so if we're not giving deliberate attention to it, then we're missing out.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marnie, I am an eager beaver today. So I'm ready to roll with my questions for you. How about you? Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Amazing. All right, Marnie, give us the newspaper headline of how you would title your untold story. How would it read?
I think it would read that I was ready to have a baby the morning of 9/11, and the headliner would be pivoting into a moment that I had certain expectations about how things would go into something that no one could have seen coming.
All right, so put that in the headline because that sounds really interesting.
I would say bringing a baby into the world on 9/11.
Okay, bringing a baby into the world on 9/11. Well, this means I just get more curious about your story, right? So bring it on. Tell us your untold story. What is it all about? Tell me more about the who, what's, when's, where's, everything.
Well, I was pregnant and due to have my baby at the end of August. And I was lucky enough that I was very healthy during my pregnancy. And so, what my doctor and I agreed to was that if I hadn't given birth by 9/11, that I would be scheduled to go into the hospital to be induced because that was as far as we felt comfortable with both my health and the health of the baby. And so it was scheduled the morning of 9/11.
Where were you living at this time?
Oh, we were living in downtown Chicago.
Okay, so you were living in Chicago.
Yeah, so we're Canadian, but we had been living in Chicago for a number of years. And it's an important question, actually, to set the scene because we lived right downtown Chicago, probably a good stone's throw from the Sears Tower. And so that becomes really relevant with how things made a big switch that morning.
Right, right.
So we had all of our lists prepared. We knew what to expect. We had our bag packed for the hospital.
So you felt like $1,000,000. You're ready to have this baby. You're all packed and ready to go.
Absolutely. And we are just about to go to the door when my husband receives a phone call that we had better put the news on. And in my head, I'm going, oh oh my God, if this is about football, I'm going to have a fit. And so, in this very terrifying and short period of time, what started as what everyone thought was just a terrible accident in New York City with the first tower being hit quickly turned into what everyone realized was the biggest terror attack on U.S. soil.
Right, that it was no accident.
It was no accident. And one of the things that became so abundantly clear was the unknown.
Right.
So, what city would be hit next? How would this unfold across the country? And, having the Sears Tower, which is now known as the Willis Tower, in our neighborhood, basically, felt very vulnerable because it was this tallest standing tower in the U.S. and a really a perfect target on a day like 9/11.
Right. So I've got to ask, so when you turned the TV on, I know that you were curious about, gosh, I hope this is not about football, but when you turned the TV on, what was the first thing that you saw?
We saw the image of the building that the first plane had hit. It alone was just horrifying. And my thought immediately was, what will happen to the people in that building? I mean, it was clearly going to cause loss of life and was something, that I had never seen anything like it before. And so it was horrifying in and of itself, even when we just thought that it was an accident.
And so knowing at that point that Chicago might be a target, how was the city preparing, or what was it like?
Well, we quickly decided that we had to, despite what was happening, we had to get to the hospital to have the baby. And so we saw exactly what was happening in the city. And, from that time of seeing the news of the first tower hit to realizing it was a terrorist attack, to getting in the car and driving, maybe 5 minutes, the city was shut down. It was a ghost town. And the only vehicles that we, passed on the way to the hospital were, police officers in cars, ensuring that no one was entering that center core of the city.
So how did you end up reaching the hospital?
Anytime that we were stopped and asked to turn away, we explained that I was having this baby. And so, of course, they would let us in. Sort of did this default behavior where we parked the car and took our little bag and walked into the hospital, and we entered the building. And on our way to registration, we came upon this woman who was a nurse in the hospital who was, had completely fallen apart and was so upset. And so we stopped to see if she was okay. And in fact, she wasn't, because she had been, fully aware of what was happening in New York and was desperately trying to reach her boyfriend who worked in Manhattan on her cell phone and couldn't get through. And I think that it was a real live example of how people are going to be affected by this. And I felt so connected to her experience. We just stopped and tried on our 3 cell phones, and we, were trying to comfort her and trying to help her talk through what she was feeling and just trying to breathe through it and trying to, I can't say I was thinking about anything. I felt so much for her. I really felt that I was seeing something in her that I didn't wish for anyone.
It must have been really devastating for her, but it also what it sounds like is it was a lot of turmoil for you just to be witness to that.
I just felt so sad for her, and it felt like it was this live example of what was to come. I don't think we had any idea of how bad it would actually get for people as a result of this terrorist attack, these attacks. But it felt like a very human application to what was happening around us, and the weight of that felt very real.
Right. And so another question I have, I'm a little curious about is, so you were living in Chicago for quite some time. Where is your family? Is your family also based in Chicago, or was there like a plan of support or people coming to see you and the baby before knowing all of what was happening in New York?
Yeah, so by coincidence and luck, my sister and her family also lived in Chicago. And so she lived in our neighborhood. She would have known exactly what was happening around the same time, I imagine. And, before all of that happened, she was sort of going to, make sure our dogs got walked while we were away. She was going to welcome my mom and dad coming from Charleston, like driving into Chicago. And to be honest, it took me a little while to realize that here I had asked my mom and dad to get in their car and drive to Chicago, and realizing that they might not have a clue. And, what would that look like for them, and what would happen, and what had I asked them to do?
Right. Must have been such a turn of events from what you had planned to what was occurring at the time. Do you feel that, because you're mentioning how so many different things were going on, meeting the nurse and who seemed to be in quite a bit of distress, did you feel like time would stop and float at the same time, where it would be like would be super fast and then it would maybe stop? Like, did you have any unique experiences like that?
Yeah, so I felt like I was sort of floating without any ability to think about what had happened before or what was coming next, and floating in these moments, just sort of trying to take it in and trying to breathe through them. And then every once in a while, there would be interference come in. And that interference might be this moment of realization that, oh, yeah, I was being moved into this room. Or,
Mm-hmm.
oh, yeah, where were my parents? Or, okay, yes, I'm ready to be induced. And so it felt like sort of like I had noise canceling headphones on that were allowing me to just go from moment to moment in this way that was probably the very best way to survive the stress of the situation. And then there would be, a television on with the newscast of how things were progressing so sadly in New York, or where the next plane had gone down, or what it had hit. And it felt like screaming noise busting into my moment to moment case.
Okay. That explains a lot about that process. And I'm curious about something that you mentioned before about, the autopilot behavior and things being different than the expectation. And so I'm curious about what it was like to have these thoughts of, I want this to happen, but I'm not going to get that desired or expected result. What was that like for you?
Well, that question is such a tough one, right? It's a tough one because it just makes my heart pound a little bit harder. I think that acted out as guilt because I obviously for months and actually for me personally for years had wanted to have the experience of having a baby and bringing a baby into what would make my husband and I a family. And that had been a work in progress for a long time. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, I wanted that same outcome. But at the same time, I was abundantly aware that what was happening around me was much bigger and much more urgent, and certainly bigger than anything I had ever felt. And I felt a little bit guilty about being the person in that equation that was going to have a really beautiful and healthy outcome from all that was happening. Here I would have this healthy, beautiful baby boy that would start the greatest adventure of my lifetime at the same time that people were experiencing tremendous loss and
Mm-hmm.
tremendous
Mm-hmm.
fear and a lot of unknown. And although that's the luckiest place to be in that equation, it didn't feel good in that I didn't want everyone else to be on the other side of that equation.
Mm-hmm. Was there any part of you, while you felt all this guilt and the fear and the unknown and being very aware that, something much bigger and more urgent and enormous is going on around you, was there any part of you that felt like, but this is supposed to be my day for me and my uterus? Like, this was supposed to be for me. Like, this was supposed to be significant for me.
I don't think so. I do remember though, thinking I need the televisions to be shut off. And I think at the time I just couldn't take any more in. And that felt really selfish, right? Like that felt like one of the more selfish things I had ever done, because it was the only way that everyone around me was learning what was happening and preparing for what was coming next. And I shut it down. And
Right.
so maybe it wasn't quite in the way that you asked the question about, hey, this is supposed to be my day. But I did feel like I can't see another image right now.
Right. This is too overwhelming. If I'm going to have this baby, if I'm going to stay focused, this is too much stimulus. All the other stuff is too much.
It was just too much. And the images were horrifying. I mean, it was the saddest, most unbelievable coverage I had ever seen. And
right.
I just couldn't have it. I don't know if what was going through my mind was maybe that I couldn't have those images be part of the energy that I would be putting into having a baby, or if it was just that I just didn't have the capacity to take it in at that moment. I'm not sure, but I do remember thinking after the fact that that was a pretty selfish thing to do, to cut off those televisions for anyone who might be in and out of our room, or even my husband who was with me.
Right. So what was it like when you were then having your baby? Like, were you able to deliver okay? Were there doctors available that you were familiar with? Was it just different medical personnel? Like, what do you remember?
Well, things really things shifted a little bit. So one of the things that happened when we first got to our room was that the woman who was our doctor, and she'd been our doctor for several years, getting us to this point, and as soon as we got to our room, she came right to me and said, "I have to leave you. My children are on the south side of the city." And I just remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, I can't imagine having children and being separated from them when there was so much fear of Chicago being hit next." And so I remember thinking, yeah, of course, and not really getting to the next thought of, well, what will happen if she leaves? What will happen? I guess I just sort of had this trust that everything would be fine, that there'd be some system in place that would sub her out, and that we were in the greatest place that we could be, and it would be fine. The other thing that I remember is that, again, sort of after the fact, people saying to me, they waited way too long to determine that you needed a C-section. We went in the morning of the 11th, and I ended up delivering Joe by C-section in the evening of the 12th.
Wow.
But I have to say, even after the fact, I felt perfectly cared for and perfectly okay.
Yeah. So it sounds like that was all happening. It's just that everything was happening in a different way, and a lot of different stimulation, and nothing was happening in the way that you would expect, as you were mentioning. I can only imagine. Did you feel like perhaps some of the delay had to do with just how your body was sort of responding to the enormity of like everything that was happening around you?
I had never had a baby before, so I wasn't sure if what was happening with my body was what should be happening with my body.
Right.
But I do think that there had to be something to what was happening around me that stopped my body from progressing with the delivery of Joe in a way that it normally wouldn't be. I believe that must be true, that if your heart is pounding a little bit harder, and you're sorting out what information you can take and what you can't. And really, if I were Joe, I wouldn't want to come into that world quite then either. So maybe it was that too. I don't know.
Well, I mean, there's definitely a trauma response on the body when you are even vicariously witnessing the intensities of what you witnessed that day. And, with everything that you mentioned about, the heart pounding and that anticipation and all that confusion and people in distress around you. And when you said, you experienced lots of different feelings, right? Like guilt and fear and all these unknowns that were coming up. Did at any point did your body feel like numb at all? Or like your knees were going to buckle or anything like that?
There was a point, and we were in the room where we thought we'd be having the baby. And I don't know why I was standing up, but I was standing up. And at that time, the television screens were on. And I remember it was images of people looking at the buildings before they had collapsed, and images of the buildings and the people who were in them. And I had a physical sensation that my body couldn't hold me any longer. And I felt just a sensation that I had never experienced before. And that was that I couldn't take it in. I couldn't imagine it. And I think I just felt so much the human beings that were in those images that I couldn't bear it. Something has to give.
Right. Just that weight of anticipation, it must have just been so overwhelming. I can't even imagine.
Well, and I remember just thinking, I would see a nurse come in, and I remember just being like fixed on who she was and how she must be feeling. And did she know someone in New York? What was her day unfolding like? Were her kids on the south side of the city?
Mm-hmm.
Was she just going about her daily tasks because she had to, because she was a professional? But what was happening in her heart? And I felt like, I don't know that I heard anyone's questions. I don't know that I was in conversation with anyone in a real way.
Marnie, it is really incredible to hear that despite all of the unknowns that you were going through and all the fear that you were sitting with, is that you still held space in a compassionate way for everyone that you were encountering, every helping professional and all the people around you. You were showing a way of holding space with compassion, and I don't know how you did that.
I felt like the only thing I could do, right, is just realize that you're part of this collective humanity, and so the very best thing you can do is be a fellow human.
Yeah, for sure. You said it so well. To just even realizing that you're a part of a collective humanity. It's that whole piece about common humanity. And when you are able to connect with other people, you stay connected. So even though it's difficult, it was brutally difficult for you in so many ways and for others in different ways, you were able to treat other people the way you were also working to treat yourself. So that compassion was there for yourself, but it was also there for others. And the fact that you were able to do that during such an intense time is really beautiful. So, Marnie, when people come to see me for therapy, people are typically in like one of three places. So, sometimes people are coming to work on a particular area of their life or particular piece. And sometimes people come when they're just getting started, or they're in the middle of it, or they're looking back. And so, what part of the journey of the story of bringing a baby into the world on 9/11 and all the impact that it had on you, where do you see yourself in the journey? Do you feel that you are getting started, in the middle, or looking back?
Oh, that's such a great question. I love thinking about stuff like this. I mean, the mathematical answers say, well, I'm past it, right? But the truth is, I'm not past it, and I don't want to be past it. I want to remember how incredibly lucky I am. And I want to take away the only good thing that you could take away from a day that was so horrible for so many people. And that is to learn that vulnerability happens and can happen hand in hand with courage, that you can find yourself in a really vulnerable place and still pull healthy tools out of your toolkit for yourself and for the people around you. And I don't want to forget it, because I want those things to be part of my mental health practice.
Absolutely. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. Thank you. So I'm interested about how you were coping with the aftermath of that from a mental health perspective. Like, how was your mental health affected afterwards? So I know we talked a lot about what you experienced, all of the different fleeting thoughts and all of the big emotions and all of the scary things and all of the things that were external happening around you, all those anticipatory moments. But after having your baby and after leaving the hospital, did it take a toll on your mental health? Like afterward, did things settle for you in your mind, or were there things that you had to work through after that, being as scary as it was?
Yes, I think so. I did for sure. And sometimes I have a little bit of a hard time remembering what that felt like at the time, but I know that I must have felt like I needed help getting through it, because I soon after connected with a counselor and have sort of made seeing a counselor and getting help regular practice of my life now. And I know that before 9/11, things happen in your life, and things, even with getting pregnant and staying pregnant and experiencing loss, those things I just had kind of tried to march through or get going on the next part of my list. And I think that sort of realizing how close it felt to disaster that day from a 9/11 perspective, I realized that I needed more help than I could just march through with my list of the next thing to do.
Right.
And I'm really thankful for that. I know that I needed it then. I certainly know that I needed it before.
Mm-hmm.
And like,
right.
holy smokes, talk about hindsight. Wow.
Mm-hmm. Right. It sounds like you were able to really tap into resource and understanding the implications and importance of having a healthy mental state. How do you feel about the fact that you were kind of trusting to surrender? And I don't know you've said those words, but it kind of feels like that's the sense I got from what you've shared so far, is that you kind of had to surrender to that process of the unknown.
Absolutely. I don't even think it was a choice. I think that it happened, and the really liberating thing about that aspect of the experience is that I think, you don't have a choice in that moment, but you realize that maybe you should just sit in moments. And maybe part of the practice for me of mental beauty and mental health is trying really hard to stay in moments instead of regurgitating past things that were painful or difficult, or worrying about future moments and what might come, and being in a fearful or worrisome state. Is that the gift of that surrender is that there is something extraordinary about just practicing being in the moments that are happening right now. I think that will be my long-term, lifelong project.
Right. Just being present in the here and now and getting better and better in each moment. Sounds like a very great tip. And so, on that note, I am curious about what is your key message to the listeners of our show?
I think what's going through my head is, be good to yourself. You're just one human in a collection of this massive humanity, and don't wait to listen for something physical to give you a signal that you need help. Choose to look after your mental health the way that you hopefully do with your physical health, and practice gratitude, because there's nothing like it. I've never experienced anything like the power of practicing gratitude.
And I think that's what I was referring to before when you were expressing what I highlighted as giving so much compassion to others. That's definitely a gratitude practice, is that you were able to be in a gracious place and the compassion just comes out. Marnie, in a private conversation we had, you had given me a really neat idea, so I'm hoping that you'd be able to share it with the listeners today. You talked about building a toolkit and sharpening tools. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I do.
Yes, please tell us more about that.
Building a toolkit is something that a counselor that I had in Chicago when I was still living there shared with me. And I think that maybe she sensed that I wasn't I didn't know what to do with the information that we were exchanging. So I carried around in my pocket this idea of building a mental health toolkit. And for me personally, what I like to carry in my toolkit is, if you're in a place and you feel like you're not being respected and you feel uncomfortable with, the information that's coming at you, know that you have the power to walk away. You can excuse yourself and you can walk away. And so I see that tool as something I never recognized before, which sounds so silly.
Not silly, just simple.
And when I think of tools, I think, so how do you use your tools to be well and to be strong? And so some of the ways I think about it are, so how do you strengthen your heart? And I think with strengthening my heart, you give love, right? You find every possible moment to give love, and you practice gratitude, right? That is another way of strengthening your heart. If you're trying to strengthen your mind, then be curious, right? In any given situation, default to being curious. Don't feel like you have all the information. So pull curiosity out of your toolkit to ask more questions, to dig a little bit deeper so that you have more information to make your choices, and you're being more respectful to the people around you, and putting trust in exchange of information kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you have the capacity to pivot. You may not be aware of it, but you do. You have the capacity to say, this is how I thought something might go, and it's not, and that's okay. I can pivot. And so I always think of my toolkit as practices that I can work on all the time, so that those simple go-to tools become power and strength for me.
It's building that toolkit, and it's going to be individualized, and you're going to collect your tools, and then you're going to sharpen your tools, and the more you practice, the sharper they are. And sometimes you make some adjustments, and so that when you're faced with the adversities and the unknowns, that's what happens. You can reach for your toolkit. As you said, you had a mental health toolkit in your pocket, right? So it's beautiful. So, Marnie, I'm curious about what's been an anchor for you. Like, what was that inspiration that was game changing for you, that's close to you, reflecting your untold story? Or is there a mantra, a quote, a book, an event, a person, something that speaks to you?
So I think for me, I feel very confident now. I have not always felt confident, for sure. I feel that I have a lot of work to become even more self confident. There is a mantra that happens inside my head that is, we are going to be fine. We're going to be okay.
We are going to be okay. We are going to be fine.
Going to be okay. And then I think, and then it's funny, I think of my dad. And the reason I think about my dad is because I think I saw what gratitude looked like when he told stories, how it would move him, this big, tough pipeliner. But boy, when he talked about what he was grateful for, it percolated everything from his heart. And so I think of him. And then sometimes I seek out quotes that people have written about gratitude. One quote in particular that stood out for me today, written by Melody Beattie. And it says, gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, a house into a home, and a stranger into a friend.
Right. Amazing. So, is there an organization or cause that has been impactful to you on your journey that you'd like to give a shout out to?
Earlier, when you were introducing me, you mentioned an organization that I worked for in Chicago called Inspiration Cafe. And boy, that was the luckiest place in the world to work. It was an organization that was built purely on the foundation of human dignity. And I learned so much from working there, and I learned so much about who I wanted to be in this world as one person and who I wanted to be in this world as a professional. And I have always been very proud of the fact that I could be and still am part of an organization that just cares about the dignity of fellow people and respecting fellow people. And so my immediate thought goes to a shout out to that organization.
That's incredible. So let's give a shout out to Inspiration Cafe. And Marnie, how can people connect with you if they would like to? How are you findable?
So you can find me on Instagram. It's at dragon.fly.clay. And I guess the other place to find me is through a chapter that I wrote mostly about this experience that we're talking about called Lead with Love.
Okay, well, then we will add those handles to the show notes and people will be able to connect with you if they would like to. Well, Marnie, guess what? You just dared yourself to share. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Salima, for providing this kind of forum. I think that you have really created something special, and your ability to connect with someone you've never even laid eyes on is something really cool. And I really appreciate what you do and how we have connected. What a nice gift.
Oh, goodness. That was really special for me to hear. Thank you so much. And Marnie, with an abundance of gratitude, I want to thank you for your willingness to be part of today's podcast. The fact that you were able to share with grace, poise, and truth right to the core. You have this incredible perceptiveness, understanding, and awareness in how you reflect on this big part of your journey. So I think I want to thank you for taking me deep into the crux of your story and for all the genuine daring and sharing.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you so much, Salima.
Wonderful. So once again, Marnie, thank you for being a part of Dare to Share Your Untold Story and helping to be a voice in breaking down the barriers of mental stigma. To all of our listeners, if you like what you've been hearing on this podcast and you want to be part of breaking down barriers of mental stigma, I invite you to go wherever you are listening to the episode and hit subscribe. Leave us a comment or a review of the episode and maybe how you relate to it. To learn more about what we offer, visit www.daretoheal.co. And if you are feeling ready and brave to share, please submit your story by visiting www.daretoshare.co. Thanks for joining in.